and Central Lakes College, recognizing that there's a lot of interest in high tunnels right now. So lots of people are building high tunnels, getting grants for high tunnels, but it's surprisingly difficult to build a high tunnel. There's not like a one size fits all. You kind of have to navigate a lot of different choices, and then you have to make a lot of modifications to your high tunnel. And there's not a lot of support for figuring out how to do that. And so we all participated in a couple of community high tunnel build projects this fall at the Village in Rochester and the Lower Farm in Northfield, and learned a lot through that process, and thought we could share what we've learned about building high tunnels with a wider audience. So this is going to be a two-part webinar. Today, we're really going to talk about design, choosing the right high tunnel for you, asking yourself questions about whether a high tunnel is really a good fit for you. And next week at the same time, we will talk some more about actually like what to grow and problems to avoid in a high tunnel. So we have a couple of presenters today. I'm Natalie. I am a vegetable crops extension educator with the University of Minnesota. We have two farmers. Andrew and Erik, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Sure. I'm Andrew, vegetable farmer for the last 12 years. I guess I'm the expert high tunnel builder here in Minnesota. I think I've built 18 of them now. So happy to answer questions, share what I've learned.
I'm Erik Heimark. I'm from Maple Ridge Produce in Aiken, Minnesota. I've been vegetable farming for about 9 years now. I also wear another hat. I'm a farm business management instructor for specialty crops, so fruit and veg growers. So I'll be talking a little bit about numbers later on today too.
And then we also have Lizzy Dawson from the Natural Resource Conservation Service, who will talk to us a little bit about grants and working with NRCS. So Lizzy, do you want to unmute yourself and say hi?
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Natalie. Yes, as Natalie said, I'm Lizzy Dawson. I am currently the district conservationist in Farmington, Minnesota. I've been in the agency for about 8 years, so I've worked across Wisconsin and Minnesota, but we're a national agency, so our friends that are in Iowa and other places, it still applies to you. I'll be transitioning into a new role, specifically working with urban, historically underserved farmers. So high tunnels are definitely going to be something I'm working with a lot in the future. So hopefully I can answer your questions when it comes to what NRCS can help with.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. All right, looks like that is working. So again, today we're really going to focus on, is a high tunnel right for you? How to select, build, and finance a high tunnel. And next week, we're going to talk more about actually managing a high tunnel. And so the agenda we're going to go through today is really based on a guide that we just published. And we're going to put the link to that in the chat. So everything we talk about, you can reference more in this guide as a follow-up. And you will also all get the slides from today. So don't feel like you have to take copious notes on everything. You'll get to reference this presentation again. So starting out, just some kind of basic facts. High tunnels are really kind of new in Minnesota. In 2007, there were only 72 of them. By 2017, we had more than 300. And we know that about 100 or more are being built every single year. So all of a sudden, there's a lot of interest in high tunnels. And unfortunately, we sometimes see that people will build a high tunnel, and then a couple years later, they're not using it because it didn't meet their needs, or they start to see some significant problems with growing things in high tunnels. So part of our goal today is that if you build a high tunnel, it'll be a good investment for you. You'll continue to use it and you'll be able to avoid some of the problems we often see. So why high tunnels? One of the most obvious reasons to build a high tunnel is for season extension. So a high tunnel is a protected structure. It warms up faster and it retains heat than outside production. And so we can grow things in the spring and the fall, which is very important in our short growing season. We can also produce a lot of food in a very small space. So for people who don't have a lot of access to land, a high tunnel can be a great way to grow a lot in a small area. We can grow things like tropical crops that don't do very well outside in Minnesota. And more, we see growers using high tunnels as a climate resilience strategy. So when we have really rainy days, it's a place where we can still get work done. In Minnesota, our spring and fall weather is becoming increasingly wet. So even though our summers are becoming hotter and drier, the seasons where we're trying to get into the field and harvest, it's getting harder to do that. And so high tunnels can be a strategy for that. And during wet years, high tunnels are a place where we sometimes have less disease pressure or diseases that are easier to manage. So there are a lot of reasons to build a high tunnel, but there are also a lot of reasons not to build a high tunnel. High tunnels tend to be a lot of extra labor. So not just building a tunnel, but maintaining a tunnel. You can see in this picture, because we have so little space, we want to use it as well as we can. And often that means growing up and trellising things. And the amount of work it takes to do that is a lot. It takes a lot of time. It can be expensive. They can be difficult to manage. It's a whole new skill set that you have to learn when you're growing things in a tunnel. And sometimes we just see people doing too much. A high tunnel is a lot of extra work. And adding that to an already busy operation can just end up being like too many things to manage. So those are some general thoughts, but I'm going to pass it to Andrew and Erik, who both have high tunnels on their farms. And they're going to talk a little bit about why they decided to get high tunnels and how their tunnels fit into the rest of their farm. So we'll start with Andrew.
All right. Yeah, so my partner Margaret and I run our vegetable farm. We cultivate 2.5 acres. It's just the two of us. And the aerial photo, that's from a few years ago, but you can see we have a large high tunnel next to the barn, and then we have these 2 caterpillar tunnels. And the reason we chose to start growing in high tunnels because the first year we were farming, we planted like 500 tomato plants out in the field. And it was a very humid and dewy summer. And we lost our entire tomato crop the first week of August due to blight. So we just saw one plant being funny, and then within a matter of days, they were all completely dead. So a U of W extension agent came and spoke to all of us Western Wisconsin growers in the St. Croix River Valley, because we all experienced it. And we learned that growing in the high tunnel was one of the best ways to mitigate that kind of fungal pressure, because they get so warm and then all that moisture evaporates so quickly. So after that, we built some caterpillars. And then when we moved to our permanent farm now, we invested in much larger structures. So we started building high tunnels. Yeah, I think that's a good intro.
I'm Erik Heimark, and I farm at Maple Ridge Produce with my partner Jay. We built our high tunnel here back in, I think this is our 7th year now, so 6 years ago. Basically because we wanted to be the first at the market with good veggies. We sell at 3 different farmers markets, and we wanted to have that kind of cutting advantage to be the first with produce. We love growing in it. We can grow a lot of good food and make a lot of and grow things that we normally couldn't, things like ginger and all sorts of fun stuff like that. And I think I got one more slide there now, Natalie, if you want to click. So we've been experimenting with all sorts of different stuff in our high tunnels. We just have the one large one, and then there's a smaller little one that I'm using. We use that when we started for regular tomatoes and stuff, and now it's just all starts, and then some raised beds where we can do some small things. But we found it is a great way to grow. You don't have as many risks in a high tunnel, it seems like. A lot of those things are mitigated. It's easier to be organic in a high tunnel. And we are going to build another one this fall. So should I just tee up right into this, Natalie? So a lot of you folks might also be thinking about getting into a high tunnel. What is the cost going to be, and is it going to pay for itself? So I went through some of the literature as well as some of my own experiences. And I think we can probably claim that, yes, the high tunnel is probably going to be an economic advantage to your farm, depending on your management. So putting on my farm business management hat and looking at what the costs is, these are average costs. And I'm taking most of my data from a guy out of Iowa who studied 5 different high tunnels. They were all the same length or dimensions. They were all 30 by 72. And one of them was a mixed vegetable operation. The other was a just tomatoes, just cucumbers, just peppers. And there's just 4, not 5. So on his study, and granted, this is a little bit fudgy data, right? Because it's only one particular spot in Iowa. It's not like the whole United States. The average budget, and everything slightly differs with what crops they're growing. But annually, people are going to spend probably about $550 to plant, fertilize, get that high tunnel ready to work. In this study, at least, they had about $1,000 worth of labor costs, and just getting that high tunnel to be upright. They figured it was about $1,000 each year if you wanted to depreciate the original cost of that high tunnel over 10 years. So again, the average cost of these high tunnels were $7,000, and the square footage was just over 2,000 square feet. And that'll be important in the next slide here, where we show average dollars per square feet. So basically, what he found after this study concluded was that, in a high tunnel, you're not actually using 100% of the space. You're using only a percentage. That's what he titled utilized space. So when looking at the cost of the high tunnel on an annual basis, the cost per square foot of that utilized space was about $1.28. And then looking at all of the yields from these different enterprises, you can see that most folks were able to exceed that. The poor pepper and cucumber folks didn't quite make it. Well, they made it just by the skin of their teeth here with 88 cents and 38 cents. But all of these operations were able to at least pay their expenses and come out ahead with just a little bit of money here. You'll notice that the mixed veg is actually paying the most per square feet here, and tomatoes are right behind it. So you have to think about when you're selecting crops, what is going to make you a little bit more money. So I wanted to show some of the data from my own farm and I did things a little bit differently than this guy. When I got my tunnel, it was a little bit bigger. It was 30 by 96, and I spent about $11,000 on it, just getting it started. And then I figure I've got about $2,000 in annual expenses just to keep that high tunnel going. And that does include labor, and it also includes like packaging supplies for selling at the market. So it's a little bit higher than his study. And then my overall, my overhead expenses, those that are, like taxes, rent, or insurance, mortgage payments, all that stuff. Those are about, I figured, another 1,100. And again, this is including some expenses that aren't 100% high tunnel related, so this might be a little bit high. But if we look at the yields that I were able, the sales I was able to generate from these yields in 2022, I came out with about $13,000 worth of sales on a mixed veg crop. And so I was able to get, you know, I had probably an average square foot cost of utilized space of $3. If I'm a little bit more, have a little heavier cost than this other study, I'm able to get, you know, some return over that. So the big question, can you, will a high tunnel be economically worth it? I think pretty safe to say yes. You know, most other operations in agriculture aren't really able to pay for themselves in the first year, and this can kind of do it. So as from an economic perspective, they're pretty okay.
All right, thanks, Erik. So you say you decide, you kind of think through the economics, you think through like, do I really have the time to commit to growing in a high tunnel? Do I want to spend the time learning how to grow things in a high tunnel? And you decide that, yeah, you think it might be a good fit for you. There are a few next steps to consider. So one of them is just assessing your farm and making sure there's a site at your farm that's appropriate for a high tunnel. So there are some basic principles. One is that you need access to irrigation. So you're blocking out all of the rainwater. And so you need to be able to add water to that site through irrigation. You want to have a site that's more or less protected from winds, an area maybe with trees in the vicinity for windbreaks. We see high tunnels sometimes get damaged by winds. You also want a flat surface, and ideally you can start with a flat surface. I see a lot of people bring in like heavy equipment to flatten the ground in areas that aren't necessarily flat to begin with, and we tend to see problems later on with soil compaction. And so starting with a spot that's naturally pretty flat is ideal. If you have too much of a slope, you're going to lose water through irrigation, or water could be like coming down slopes into that site. Similarly, you don't want to be at the bottom of a valley. If you have too much water coming in, you can start to have problems with disease. You want to have sunlight for most of the day. And think about practicality. Like, you really want your high tunnel to be a space that's easy to access. It's a space you're going to have to go into every single day. You're going to be taking equipment in and out. You're going to be harvesting heavy boxes of produce and bringing them out of the tunnel. So you don't want to have to walk too far from a road to your buildings. You should have access to electricity, ideally. And then you also want to look at your soil. Ideally, the soil in an area with a high tunnel will not be too heavy. It'll be kind of like a sandy soil or loamy soil, ideally not a really heavy clay. And this can seem really overwhelming. So one thing that I like to say is to get help with this process. So you could have your local extension educator come out, or you can reach out to your local natural resource conservation service. And often they can come to your site and help you think through like what would be the best site for a tunnel here. And finally, it's also really important to check with your county and your city. Every county, every city has different zoning related to high tunnels. And so again, that's something that your extension person or your NRCS person may be able to help you navigate to. So you've thought through your operation, you think maybe you want to get a high tunnel. Usually the first step is to reach out to the Natural Resource Conservation Service. So I'm going to have Lizzy jump in from NRCS and just talk a little bit about what that's like, both from the perspective of coming out and doing a site assessment and then also accessing funds.
Thank you, Natalie. I think on the next slide, we might have some there. Perfect. Okay, so my best advice would be to reach out early. NRCS, we're happy to come out and do that site visit with you to see what would be a suitable site. It doesn't have to be before you apply. It can be after. So one thing, if you don't know where your local office is, I strongly encourage you to either reach out to myself or somebody else, and we can help you find that office. Sometimes our process takes a little bit of time. So it is the federal government. It doesn't always pick as quickly as we would hope. High tunnels is something in Minnesota where we're able to move a little quicker in a process called Act Now when there's funds available for it. But as you're seeing, high tunnels are becoming very popular, and there is a lot of competition. So their NRCS programs are competitive, so there's no guarantees in funding, but we are able to help you with technical support, even if we're not able to help you financially. As far as the application process goes, if you are new to NRCS and don't have any records established already, we can help you do that as well. So that's done through the Farm Service Agency, or FSA. And the items you see listed there in orange are the ones that we would need right away to get that application entered into the system. So we do take batching cycles. Otherwise, if your state doesn't have Act Now for high tunnels, and it could take up to maybe a year or longer. So certainly reach out even as soon as you are thinking about this process. If we're able to fund you quicker, you're not tied to anything, you are able to push it back a little bit if you need more time for next year. But these papers these documents that I have listed here in orange, a lot of that can just be done right away in the office. I have a little friend here peeking in. But one thing that you will need to have when you come to the office is that lease or the deed for the property. That's one thing that you'll need to take with you that FSA wouldn't be able to have. If you already have a farm and track number, you would not need to have the things in orange. Adjusted gross income is every year. That's verified with the IRS. And the application. So you would be able to call the office. We can do that over the phone and fill out that application to get you into the system. There are other documents that might be needed along the way, but that might be up to an individual situation basis. So I didn't want to overwhelm the slide here. But that is NRCS in a nutshell, I guess.
And Lizzy, are you able to say like, when people do get EQIP funding to build a high tunnel, how much of the cost of the high tunnel does it typically fund? Does it vary every year?
It varies every year and by state. So typically if you're in Minnesota, Wisconsin, I believe Michigan, they kind of all look together to see what those rates are. We have economists that work on that as well. But it's something close to 50 to 90% of the cost, depending on situation, location, and a lot of different factors. I will also put in that it is, if you are awarded some cost share, NRCS is not able to help put up the high tunnel. We would love to help, but we can't. We're not allowed to. It also has to be a new kit. So it has to be purchased from a manufacturer that meets standards and recommendations from the NRCS. And if you are awarded a contract, you have 12 months from that beginning of when you sign that paperwork to get it installed. So kind of making sure NRCS timelines work with your personal farm timelines is also very important.
All right, thanks so much, Lizzy. So Erik showed us some financial data at the beginning. You can see a lot of the costs are upfront costs, and so it's really worth reaching out to NRCS to get some of those high tunnel costs covered. There are farmers who self-fund high tunnels too. You don't have to work with NRCS, but it's a great resource that's worth exploring. And so that was a really good segue because, like Lizzy said, NRCS may be able to help fund the high tunnel, but they will not come out and build it. That is totally on you. You have to figure out how you're going to build your high tunnel. And unfortunately, there's really not a one size fits all. There are lots of options for different styles and brands. And so Andrew mentioned that he has built 18 high tunnels. So he has a lot of experience with the different types of tunnels. And so he's going to walk us through a few considerations for figuring out like where to start, which type of high tunnel might be the best fit for you.
All right. So yeah, like the slide says, high tunnels versus caterpillar tunnels. They both have their wonderful qualities, and then they also have, you know, their challenges. So high tunnels, or we'll start with caterpillars. Caterpillars are inexpensive. You can assemble them out of PVC pipe and rope, some earth anchors. That was our first rendition of one. They can be metal framed. They typically are tall enough for you to walk in them, but they're not very tall. And then as far as resilience to weather events, that kind of thing, a PVC one, not very resistant to wind, metal, definitely a lot more strength. But, you know, when you experience really high winds, you know, don't have a lot of faith in that they're going to stay up or not be damaged. You know, and then when you move over to a high tunnel, you know, they're a lot more resilient. You've got a lot more headroom, so you can grow your crops vertically. They will warm up and stay warm longer. So with a caterpillar in, you know, the fall, when we're starting to get those first frosts, you know, you do have a little bit of a temperature buffer, but things will freeze much sooner in a caterpillar than they will in a high tunnel. There's just a lot more mass in a high tunnel to kind of mitigate that. And with a caterpillar versus a high tunnel, you know, you can automate some of the venting. So, you know, there is more maintenance, but at the same time, like, you know, if you have things to do in the morning and you forget to open up the walls on your high tunnel, but it's got automatic opening vents, you've just bought yourself a few hours. So that's very nice. And yeah, and it's really tough to get a tractor inside of a caterpillar, whereas a high tunnel, you know, if you're using tractors or larger, you know, walk behind tractors, that's a lot. There's just a lot more flexibility in there. So yeah.
Andrew,
then-
can you just define for people who are brand new to high tunnels what a caterpillar tunnel is?
Oh, sure.
A
So
little high
caterpillar,
tunnel.
yeah. A caterpillar tunnel, I guess if I was to define it, it's going to be probably no wider than like 16 feet, no taller than 8 feet. And yeah, they just it's going to be a single layer of plastic. And then a high tunnel is going to be much wider. You know, a narrow one is 20 feet, but they can be as wide as 36 feet. And they tend to be usually like 10 to 14 feet tall at their highest. And then they typically are quite a bit longer than a caterpillar. You know, 72 feet is a standard length, 96 feet. I've seen some farms where they join multiple 96-foot ones. So yeah, it can be kind of endless in that way. So these are 3 photos. The one in the middle and the one on the left are high tunnels, and then the one on the right is a caterpillar. They all have metal skeletons to them. Like I said, we kind of moved away from using PVC. PVC is great as a temporary caterpillar, but it's not UV resistant, so that plastic gets really brittle after even a single season. So when it does get moved by wind, it will actually just break and shatter. So yeah. The tunnel on the left has got 2 layers of plastic. It's got a mostly clear transparent layer, and then it has a woven plastic layer on top of that. And I went with that type of plastic because it's super resilient to hail. they advertise it with people like jumping on top of the high tunnel, and the plastic doesn't stretch or anything like that. And then, so the high tunnel in the middle, that's a single layer of plastic. It's clear plastic. Both of those tunnels are a Quonset style tunnel. So it's like a half circle rather than having a peak to the top. And then the Caterpillar tunnel is also kind of a Quonset style. It doesn't have a peak to it. Yeah, let's see. So all of these tunnels, I built them with roll-ups. That's how I vent them. You can't see, but the two high tunnels also have peak vents with a lifter in them that's temperature actuated. So once it gets to like 85 degrees, it springs open and opens up those vents. That's what I was saying. Like if I forget to roll up the walls, at least I have that, and they can breathe a little bit and vent that hot air out. So yeah, next slide. Yeah, so Natalie touched on this. There's like 6, maybe there's 10 different brands of tunnels that you can get. And no two company is the same. And they all kind of have their certain qualities to them, either being more economic, or much more weather resilient. But all of them, when you purchase a kit, it's all of the hardware. So it's all the metal bits. Typically, most of the screws you're going to need. And some companies will sell you like doors, but most of the time that's kind of on you to make. So it'll be the plastic, the metal bits, but any of the lumber that is required for like the baseboards, or they're called hip boards or ribbon boards, the boards in the middle of the wall. That's all on you to buy that. All the framing for the end wall, you've got to buy all that lumber yourself. So like the sticker price of like $11,000 for a tunnel is just the metal. You're probably going to spend another $2,000 on lumber. So these are the two shapes. We've got Gothic, and then we've got Quonset or rounded roof. I like the Gothics a lot, especially for up here in Minnesota, Wisconsin, where we do get, this last winter we got lots of snow. Gothics tend to shed the snow a lot better. Whereas a Quonset, especially the wider they get, that slope becomes so gradual. If your plastic's not super, super tight and brand new, that snow will stay there. So since we only have Quonset styles, I have a push broom with a 20-foot long PVC pipe connected to that. And if we get those wet, heavy snows, I'm out there a couple times during the snowstorm, sweeping it off. Whereas our Gothic, we have actually a greenhouse with a Gothic roof. I don't really have to worry about that. So end walls and doors, like I mentioned, a high tunnel versus a Caterpillar. High tunnels can accommodate, having a tractor come in there, or a large walk behind tractor or tiller. You're going to want to design your end walls with that in mind. Do you want a tractor to come in? And maybe you're not even using a tractor to till. Maybe you just need a large machine to come in and bring, a large pallet size of like compost, or you're going to be walking in and out with something larger than like a wheelbarrow. You're going to want to decide like how big of that end wall or door do we want. If you're doing everything by hand and you only need a wheelbarrow, you can always just build an end wall with a normal like 36-inch wide house door. But the bigger the door, it is nice that you can open that, and that's an added space to ventilate your high tunnel. So these are a couple shots of, I think it's just, oh no, it's both tunnels. So we irrigate in our tunnels, and depending on what we're growing, we have a couple options. So the image on the left is, those are called wobblers. So they're like sprinklers that just like kind of wiggle and they fan out water. And then we also use the slide in the middle and the one on the right, we use drip irrigation. And they both have kind of their added benefits. If the reason I'd use the wobblers is it covers a larger area and I wanted to get all of the soil wet rather than just where my seeds were. Just to kind of like it in my thought process is it's just a way to like kind of wake up the ground, wake up the microbes from the winter time. Whereas like drip irrigation, it's really nice for like direct seeded things. So like the bed on the left there, those are radishes and herbs. And like I just want to water those. I don't want to water the seeds, the weed seeds that are near that. Yeah. And then, oh, yep, that's fine. We should go to the next one. So yeah. Natalie mentioned, you know, maintaining and managing a high tunnel takes quite a bit of work. And our tunnels were built on top of where we were farming outside. So like we have a lot of weed pressure in there. And, you know, there's a lot of weeding that needs to happen in order for like this image of the bok choy to look that good. Like, you know, it doesn't just happen overnight that things work that well. But, you know, we use high tunnels to grow really early stuff. And then we like to overwinter things and then have late crops. The photo of me holding the bunch of carrots, that's just from a few weeks ago. I've been growing carrots in our tunnel, and that particular tunnel has got some buffers in it so the frost can't creep into our tunnel. So a lot of stuff stays alive a lot later. And then the next image with the bok choy there, we've got hoops. So I'll use row cover to keep those like more kind of like sensitive plants buffered from the cold, because it does get, the air temperature gets cold, but the ground is still plenty warm. And then the next image, that's a bunch of spinach, and like it's one of the best crops to grow in a tunnel because you seed it in September, you can get a harvest before it gets too cold, and spinach overwinters, and then come March, it comes out of dormancy, starts growing again, and then you can get 3-4 harvests of spinach before you want to, you know, turn things over and start growing radishes or even plant your tomatoes in there. So we do grow a lot of head lettuce in our tunnels too. This particular variety of head lettuce isn't light sensitive. So like it doesn't matter if the days are 9 hours of daylight or if they're 14 hours of daylight. So great crop to use. You know, in November and then carry on into, you know, December, so long as it doesn't get too cold.
Right. So those were some like basic design considerations. And then we have a few more things. So as in my role as a vegetable educator, I visit hundreds of high tunnels. And I see a lot of things going really well, and then I see some things going not so well. And there are 3 kind of big things that I see that you can avoid by designing your high tunnel right. So one of them is when people buy like the cheapest option, their tunnels are often not as structurally sound as they could be. If you look on a number of high tunnel vendor websites, you'll see like you can buy the tunnel with arches every like 6 feet or every 4 feet. And it's more expensive to have more metal in your tunnel, but you get more structural support. And so especially if a site is really windy, if you're in a spot where you get a lot of snow, or if your soil is more sandy, it's more important to reinforce that tunnel. And so you can do that. In some ways, you can do it by buying the more expensive tunnel. So the one that has more arches or more purlins. Those are the long metal beams going across the top. And sometimes you can also do it by kind of adding your own support to it. So adding boards along the bottom, adding wind braces, that's this third picture here. And then also adding more structural support to the top. Andrew, do you want to say anything else about that?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of tactics, and knowing where your tunnel is and where your farm is and like what you normally experience, definitely dictates how to build your tunnel to be as resilient as you can. Yeah, that third rendition of a tunnel with the wind braces, I go nuts with those. Like I have multiples, and the longer the better, because I want to distribute as much of those forces on as many footings as possible. I've seen tunnels where they only have a few of those braces and they accordion and just do that. And I've seen tunnels where placement of purlins are either too far apart, or they're too close to each other, and then snow load happens, stretches the plastic, and will actually push the arches away, and then they fold in on themselves. So there's definitely things to consider, and these are things that I've learned over the tunnels that I've built, and you very likely won't read about in your instructions for your tunnel. They're not going to explain that. They'll say make sure everything's tight, but that doesn't solve most of those problems, or at least combat some of them.
And Andrew, there's a question here. How do you actually get those wind braces? Are you going to like Menards or Lowe's and just buying those? Or are you sourcing them specially?
Nope, they're not special. They can just be, there's a piping you can get from those big box stores called Top Link. It's 1 3/8 inch diameter tubes, and you can get them in lengths of 20 feet. They work great as far as wind braces. If you want to have additional purlins, you can use those. And then depending on who you're getting your tunnel from, you can always ask for more piping. For example, Nolt's down in Iowa, when you're buying your kit, their piping is going to be less expensive than if you bought it at Menards. And it'll be lumped into that freight charge anyway, so you're not really out more money that way.
Great, thanks. So the second problem that I see, this is actually the most significant problem that I see. Like if I had a magic wand and I could change something about every high tunnel, it would be the ventilation. I don't see nearly enough ventilation in high tunnels, and that results in crop stress and disease pressure. So really, like hot air leaves through the top of a tunnel. So you can have roll-up sides, and that's great. That's a really important way for cold air to come in through the bottom, but you need a way for hot air to leave through the top. So I see a lot of tunnels that don't have any vents on the top, or vents that are way too small. And basically you just want like a big vent on either side of the tunnel. There are some fancier systems for like releasing air from the top, and we cover those in the guide, which we're going to share with you at the end. But they tend to be more complicated, and people have more problems with them. So really like just a big gable vent at either side, that's what you see in this picture, is ideal. And then having fans throughout the high tunnel to help circulate that air is also really important. So that's one reason why it's important to have electricity in your high tunnel, is just to be able to have fans in the tunnel to help circulate that air. And then the third thing that I see, we think so much about like we're trying to create a warm environment so we can grow crops in the fall and in the spring. And we see it get too hot in the middle of the summer. So vents can definitely help with that. But for certain crops, like peppers will often get sunburnt. That's the picture on the left. And then cucurbit crops, so like cucumbers, are really sensitive to being able to set fruit during high temperatures. And so we see a lot of problems with fruit set where the fruit just gets deformed and never grows. And so for certain crops in the hottest part of the summer, it's actually recommended to use shade cloth, a 30% shade cloth. And if you've ever worked in a high tunnel in August, it's pretty miserable. It's really hot in high tunnels. And being in a high tunnel with shade cloth is so much more pleasant, like for you as well and your own body. So that's something I don't see a lot of, but it is something to consider if you're growing a lot of your high value crops right in the middle of the summer. And so we're kind of running out of time. We started a little bit late, but we're just going to kind of quick recap a few lessons that we learned from these community builds that we did this fall. And then we'll have a few minutes for questions, and we can stay on later if people want to keep asking questions. So Andrew, what did we learn about time? How long did it take us to build a high tunnel?
Well, like anything farming, if you think it takes 2 hours, it's going to take 4. But yes, many hands make for light work. So if you can at least have a team of 4 people, building a tunnel can happen in a reasonable amount of time. Feel like 4 people who have some comfort level with like power tools and things like that, you can build a tunnel in about 20 hours. So, you know, a weekend and maybe 1 or 2 more days. It's really the tedious parts that will be the big time suck. So it's the framing of an end wall, putting in a door, but getting the arches and the borders on the sides, that goes by so fast. But the most important part to anything in a high tunnel is prep. So make sure you've got everything square, you've got everything marked, and if you get your footings in perfectly, then everything else goes much better. This is a great photo of, you know, general tools you're going to need. So cordless drills, an impact cordless drill drives those self-tapping screws so much better than just a normal cordless drill. You're going to need hacksaw, ear protection, hand protection. Typically we're building these on sunny days, so sun hats, that kind of thing. Having access to electricity makes a world of difference when you have to cut lumber. I've done it without electricity, and yeah. And like I said, the more the merrier. If you can have people help lift things, hold things, it is a very exhausting process. Yeah, I've never been so tired as I've been at the end of a high tunnel build day. Yeah. As far as tools go, though, like there's nothing special. The most special tool is an insert for your footings, and that is supplied by the high tunnel vendor. So whatever kit you get, it's going to come with this particular plug that goes in the pipe. But everything else you can get at a store. If you can rent the tools, totally do it. There's a gas powered post pounder that will save you so many calories if you use that. If you have a tractor, even better. You can push those footings down with a tractor bucket. World of difference. So this is a video of my friend. I helped him build this tunnel, and this is kind of a very quick process on how to put the plastic on. So as you can tell, it's not windy. Typically those days happen when there's not a huge temperature swing. So we're not having really cold mornings, but warm midday afternoons. You want it to be like, it's supposed to be 50 degrees this morning. It's only going to be 55 in the middle of the day. You won't have any wind. If it's wet, you can still put plastic on, but the moisture on your plastic when it's going over that piping almost is like Velcro. So just be mindful of that. You'll probably need somebody in there like with something very like kind of blunt, like a broom, pushing and adding air and moving things. but being patient and moving slowly when you're putting plastic on will save you so much stress. And if it's any windier than 10 miles an hour, don't do it. Save yourself the stress. Just wait. There will be a day when it's not windy.
Oops. All right. So as you can see, there's so much to talk about with high tunnels. We could have like a 15-part webinar and we still wouldn't cover everything. So that's why we are doing 2 separate webinars. So next week we'll have more time to talk about actually growing in a high tunnel. So we'll talk about kind of the best crops to grow, how to trellis and prune, and then avoiding some common problems with high tunnel soils. So I know that was a lot, but we are happy to stick around. I know many of you will probably plan to leave right at 6:30, but we will stick around and answer questions for as long as you have them. Matt is going to launch a poll here. So just a quick poll that'll show up on your screen. And as soon as you fill it out, it'll disappear. So we've kind of been answering questions in the chat as we go. But we can recap some of those. Just some kind of logistics things. If you signed up for this webinar, you're going to get an email with the recording of this presentation and the slides, as well as that guide. So keep an eye on your inboxes in the next couple days for that. And thank you to all of our presenters and interpreters. So I'll just recap a few of the things in the chat because I know you're probably not all watching the chat as we go. We had quite a few questions about vents. So a couple of people asking about ridge vents. That is, we didn't actually explicitly talk about ridge vents, but there are some pictures of that in the guide that we developed. So that's where you actually have the vent running across the top of the high tunnel instead of on either end. I will say, and then Andrew, I want to hear your perspective. I only know a couple people who have ridge vents and they hate them because it's like too many moving pieces. And when things break, it's like kind of a nightmare to fix them. But I would love to hear your thoughts, Andrew.
You know, if the automation works, then they're great. I worked at Gardens of Egan, and they bought their greenhouse operation from, or their propagation house from a big greenhouse plant start place, and that did work, which was great. But I have a friend who farms out in New York, and she was given this high tunnel to work in, and the automation is terrible. It opens when it's not supposed to, like the furnace kicks on and then the vent opens, so it's just, yeah. I think they look attractive, and on a commercial setting, great idea, but in a small scale vegetable farm situation, there are better ways to vent your tunnel that don't require a lot of moving parts.
So someone asked about companies that they've worked with. So in the guide you're going to get, there are a list of all of the Midwest companies that we know of that sell high tunnels, but anyone else, like, feel free to put in the chat a company that you've worked with if you've had a good experience or have a recommendation. Yeah, you can feel free to add that. Todd had a great question. If you get a grant or an award outside of NRCS, can you still get an NRCS cost share? And Lizzy, I see you wrote something, but do you want to just answer that for everybody?
Yes, absolutely. So from an NRCS perspective, yes, you are still eligible for our cost share for NRCS. Sometimes though, you just want to check with that other assistance, if it's a grant, if it's local assistance, that sometimes they have requirements where you can't get outside funding, or they'll only fund up to a certain amount. But from NRCS perspective, absolutely.
Great. There were a couple questions about perennials and cover crops, and we are going to talk a lot about that next week. We actually have a really cool opportunity for you to participate in a high tunnel cover crop project. So we'll include a flyer about that, and we'll talk more about that next week. But cover crops are really great in high tunnels. Someone asked about orientation. And Erik, it looks like you answered that. Do you want to address that for folks who aren't looking at the chat?
Sure. So the question was, should I orient my high tunnel north and south or east and west? What's best? What's optimal? I guess there's been quite a bit of studies on that, and it just shows it doesn't matter at all. So in that case, you definitely want to position your high tunnel in, if you can, where the gable ends, those sidewalls are facing the winds that are most predominant or the most heavy winds in your area. So if that's northwest, try to get your tunnel to face northwest. It'll handle the winds a lot better that way. But you can orient it whatever way works for you. Your plants won't mind.
Tiberius asked the difference between a greenhouse and a high tunnel. Andrew, do you want to answer that?
Sure. The greenhouse is heated and the high tunnel isn't.
Yeah, basically.
Typically, you're growing in the ground in a high tunnel too, where greenhouses
Yes.
sometimes elevated or have a concrete floor.
The one exception I will say is we see some people who have a high tunnel where they'll put concrete in like a little part of it at the end. And then they'll start their seeds kind of in the one end of the tunnel and put down a couple layers of plastic so that they're heating only a part of it, because it's really expensive to heat a tunnel. And then like as you need more space, you can kind of expand that area and then like turn the heater off and grow things in the ground once you're done starting seeds. A lot of other people have a totally separate space to start seeds in. Sarah's wondering about the Four Seasons Tools plug-in roof system that was developed with Elliot Coleman. Does anyone have any experience with that? I don't. If someone else does, who's not a presenter, feel free to share.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with what that is.
Me neither.
We'll have to look into it. Anything else?
We have a
And we
question from Tiberius about whether it's is there value doing a high tunnel versus a greenhouse? And I'd say it basically comes down to money. I think if you have a ton of money, go ahead and do a greenhouse. It's wonderful. But high tunnels are a nice way to get started without all that capital expense.
and to be able to grow in the ground all season.
Yeah.
So Kelly's wondering, do the inflated double layers require an electric fan? And yeah, usually they have a little, it's just a little fan. It can be like this big, and it just blows air in between those two layers, just to give you like that little pocket of insulation.
But you don't need to use a blower to have air in between those two layers. Amish farms, from what I've heard, still use foam over the piping. So they'll have the layer and then they'll put foam on top of that and then put the next layer of plastic on. That's a way so they can have that temperature, that little bit of R value without, embracing 20th century technology.
But it's also pretty easy to add a little fan.
Yep, it is.
Right, so we have a few people recommending, people have had good experiences with, I don't know how to pronounce this, Rimol. and Nultz. Those are different companies. So Beth's wondering, could you share what kept people from continuing with a high tunnel after a few years? That's a great question. I think for a lot of people, it was like just more work than they bargained for. And they were like, well, we don't really want to do this anymore. We want to simplify. Or in some cases, maybe people haven't had the support that they needed, like their crops just aren't doing as well in a high tunnel. Couldn't figure out why. So hopefully that doesn't happen to any of you. Like Extension has a lot of people who know about high tunnels, and like we are here to support you anytime you're seeing problems in your high tunnels. We don't want to see you like build a high tunnel and then give up on it. So yeah, I think for a lot of people, it's more just that planning piece, that it's like kind of a cool new thing and they want to try it. And then it's like, this just doesn't really fit with my goals anymore. Let's see, is it important for the soil to freeze each year? No, often the soil never freezes in a high tunnel. I think it's more important that the soil doesn't get really, really dried out. That's one of the things we see, and we'll talk more about soil next week. But the soil doesn't have to freeze. How many high tunnels is too many?
Oh, wait, there's one before that though.
Oh,
Okay, yeah, we can talk about
I like
tillage
that. I
first.
mean, I'm excited about that one.
Yeah, so
so-
just ground prep. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Erik.
So I have those two high tunnels. The one with the woven plastic, that was all tilled, and it was tilled because that was a field that I was using in general. But the other tunnel, the bigger one, I built it. I just mowed that area, and then I built the structure, and then inside I put black silage plastic to kill everything. Then I removed it, and I planted directly into that, and then mulched it with straw. That tunnel has nearly 12% organic matter in the soil. And then the other tunnel has 7%. So, but before I built that tunnel on that tilled ground, it only had 3% organic matter. So Natalie will go into this, I think, next week. And we're part of this study, but it's amazing how much you can build that soil organic matter level in a tunnel.
I would say you want to remove most of that vegetation though, like weed management in a high tunnel can take a lot of time. So you want to be able to kill that vegetation somehow. And that could be through tillage, or tarping is a pretty common strategy. Just put a tarp down for like 6 weeks. Some people will use herbicides. Should we answer these two questions? I think they go well together, from someone with the name Matt Barthelemy and then Beth. How many tunnels is too many? Like, how did you two decide on the right number of tunnels for your farm? And what kept you interested in continuing to grow in your tunnels?
You should go first, Erik.
okay. How many is too many? Ooh, well, I don't have enough, so I guess I'm not gonna answer. Be very good at answering that. So I just have the one big one. I have like a small, 20 by 12 footer. But I wish I had two, and I haven't gotten more of them yet, mostly from labor and a little bit of cost, but I think, I could have probably gotten another one. I've been more concerned about labor. We have hired folks now, and they are going to continue next year, so I'm ready to take that next step. If I were to go around again, I would have, instead of getting one big tunnel, I would have got two smaller ones, so I could have done rotations a little better. So I think maybe the question of how many is too few, probably one. So at least two, I guess, to answer that one. But man, if you got staff, get a bunch of them.
Yeah, I mean, money is typically the thing that is going to hold you back. So, yeah, between my partner and I managing two fairly large high tunnels, that's where we do like a third of our growing. So keep that in mind. Like, how big is your operation? How much time do you want to dedicate to that? And then just, if you can make it a routine and part of your routine, then it's more manageable. But yeah. Also, the more high tunnels, especially if they're all manually operated, that's it. More tunnels you have to close when you see that wall cloud coming. You've got to run, and you're like, how fast can I move my arms?
Yeah, high tunnels are like fields on steroids. So the amount of work you have in a field is going to be like a lot more in a tunnel. So think about that as you add more. You're going to have more work.
We have a couple questions that are more like structural. So someone's wondering, are there usually support stands down the middle of a high tunnel, or does all of the support come from the side pipes? Andrew, do you want to explain kind of how the high tunnel holds itself up?
Sure. So that aerial photo of our farm, that tunnel that you saw that was by the barn, that was actually a greenhouse from one of like a Cub Food grocery store when they build those plant propagation houses for spring plants. And that particular model actually does have pipes that go in the middle to hold them up for snow and stuff like that. Yeah. That one that's near the barns there. But most of the time they don't have supports in the middle. Usually it's going to be kind of a bar that goes across, and then there's kind of a network of other cross braces. That's what keeps them strong with like those big loads that happen on the roof. So that's wind, snow, rain. Yeah. The closer the arches are, the more there's more arches to distribute those stresses.
Then there's a question about weed cloth underneath the baseboards.
Yeah. I answered that typing, but I built them both ways, and both at my place and with other farmers. And having that piece of weed barrier underneath your baseboards means you don't have to weed whap around your greenhouse all of the time. The one tunnel that I have that's out in our field that has these buffers from the frost, I couldn't do that on the sides, on the outside. So I mow around that thing every 2 weeks.
Don't cheap out on that. I did, and I'm regretting it. Spend the extra money, get some landscape fabric, put it underneath there, and you'll save yourself money and the amount of time. Like,
Yes. And then Tiberius, we'll come back to your question, but since we're kind of on the topic of building, Jared just asked, can you expand a little bit more about adding form or maybe the foam between the two layers of the plastic roof?
I can't, because I've never seen it. I've just heard it. I know like Johnny, maybe it's Johnny's. They also have like these plastic boxes that sit on like the peaks of each arch to help build that bubble. But yeah, I've just heard about it. It'd be fun to go visit an Amish farm that has high tunnels, so I could see how they do it.
We have another, so Tiberius asked a question about marketing. And I will say, like, we will talk a lot more about this next week. But this is probably the other reason we see people build tunnels and then give up on them, is they're like, I'm going to plant a whole high tunnel full of tomatoes. And then you do all of this work, and then you have to figure out how to sell like 1,000 pounds of tomatoes, and you don't have a market. And so you've just done all of this work for nothing. So it's really important to know where you're going to sell stuff before you plant it. And that could be partially at your farmer's market. You're not going to sell a whole high tunnel of tomatoes at your farmer's market, though. Could be local schools, your farmer's market food hub. Erik, do you want to say anything about marketing?
Yeah, just cast a wide net early on and make sure to build some emotional calluses because you'll probably get rejected a lot, but that's okay. You'll find your market. Niches are out there. Just keep trying. Go to a couple different farmers markets. Maybe try putting up a roadside stand. Just kind of see what happens. And uh, be ready to fail and fail fast. Like, okay, this isn't working. I'm going to try something else. Yeah, it's totally okay to make a couple cold calls. Call that grocery store. Call the co-op. Just check them out. See if they want to buy from you.
And Eric, you shared that slide, this one showing that mixed vegetables were often more profitable. And I
Mhm.
think that's something to consider with marketing too, that sometimes people feel like their whole high tunnel should be the same crop, but that doesn't have to be true at all. You can have like a row of one thing and a row of another thing, and you're much less likely to have like a failure to sell stuff if you have a diversity of things. And then if this year it goes really well and you sell all of your tomatoes and people are asking for more, you can do more next year.
I kind of use my high tunnel as almost like a marketing device. So I have my I have pole beans in there. I've got zucchinis in there. I've got all these stuff that you wouldn't necessarily think would be a good choice because they're not high dollar value, but it allows me to have them first at the market. And then you kind of train people to come to your stand because you had it first. So, you can use it for that sort of thing.
So there's a really good question here about patching high tunnels. High tunnels get holes in them all the time from crows or from other things, hail. I've only used the tape. Have either of you used something other than the high tunnel tape?
And there's been some situations where there's some pretty big holes. And that requires a little more creativity with fixing it. Depending on how large that hole is, where it's at. I've gone as far as there's a piece of metal called wiggle wire channel, and that's like kind of what keeps the plastic onto that metal frame. Buying some more of that, and like, let's just say you have a large hole that happened in between two arches. You could build like a picture frame with that wiggle wire channel, and then you cut out the plastic and lay a new piece in and wiggle wire in that new piece. But typically, like, don't expect your plastic to be immaculate after 5 years. Changing it out every 5 to 7 years is pretty routine. Piece of plastic on a 30 by 96 tunnel is somewhere in the ballpark of $700. So you stretch that out, $700 over 5 years. Like, that's really not that much money. But yeah, I've used the tape, and it's all about getting it as clean as possible, that area, and laying it out, no air bubbles whatsoever. And I expect that tape to stay and be pretty good for about 2 years. But I don't expect a lot of that plastic. That plastic is 0.6 millimeters thick. It's not very strong.
Yeah, one rip or one hole isn't gonna like destroy your whole tunnel. You'd be amazed. Like, even with the 2 layers, that stuff can still keep blowing and still keep going. So we've had a couple holes or tears up pretty high where it's just hard to get to, and we're just like, well, we're gonna change that in 2 years. We'll deal with it then. So
And it's also like, we'll again talk more about this next week, but it can be good for your soil to leave the plastic off for a season every once in a while. And so when your plastic becomes so full of holes that it's not repairable, it can actually be a really good thing to just take it off and kind of let your tunnel breathe and get some rainwater and snow into your tunnel. Don't see any more questions. So again, you're going to get an email with this recording and the slides and our guide, and we will include our emails. So feel free to follow up and reach out with questions. Hopefully you can join us next week. We have a lot more to talk about. We're also going to have some like high tunnel field days this year. So there will be lots of opportunities to keep learning about high tunnels. Matt, is there anything you want to say to wrap up?
I don't think so. I just appreciate everybody showing up for this. It's been a really awesome project to work on, and I'm really grateful to have such an awesome team that I'm working with. Natalie, everybody here, Erik and Andrew and Lizzy. It's been really cool, and I really appreciate Cod doing the interpretation, and we'll get that figured out. And everybody's got my name, and hopefully we can figure out how to change that next time. But that's all right. No, I'm excited to tune in for the second part of this, because for me, that's where I'm going to learn a lot.
And you guys should all thank Matt, because he started this all from like, hey, let's go around and help people build high tunnels. And now it's become the seminars, and it's great. So thank you, Matt.
Yeah, we do this together. We all work together as farmers. I don't have anything else though, Natalie. Should I round it out? I just say, yeah.
Have
no,
a good night, everybody. See you next
Yeah.
week.
Yeah, look forward to seeing y'all next week.